I hate this information. But I speak of it anyway. Apologies. The world according to the World Bank. Video 3 on the war connection. So then there's the World Bank, which is presented as a savior to the third world. The long-term, extremely low interest rates the World Bank offers to the underdeveloped countries have a real dark side. I quote, "The unseen aspect of the operation is that the money it processes is money which otherwise would have been available for investment in the private sector or as loans to consumers. It siphons off much-needed development capital for private industry, prevents new jobs from being created, and causes interest to rise, and retards the economy at large." End quote. This process is deeply woven within this above goal to maintain perpetual warfare, which I spoke of in the last video, with the publicly declared goal of maintaining global peace and prosperity. Julius Nyerere, the dictator of Tanzania, I spelled dictator wrong, is notorious for his villagization program, in which the army has, I quote, "driven peasants from their land, burned their huts, and loaded them like cattle into trucks for relocation into government villages. The purpose is to eliminate opposition by bringing everyone into compounds where they can be watched and controlled. Meanwhile, the economic staggers, farms have gone to weed, and hunger is commonplace. Yet Tanzania has received more aid per capita from the World Bank than any other nation," end quote. Other examples include Ethiopia in the 1980s, Laos, Syria, Indonesia, Java, Nicaragua, Poland, China, and the Soviets. They've all had corrupt regimes while being heavily funded in the billions of dollars by the World Bank. There have been many more before that. The corporations and other agencies fund regimes that are oftentimes open about their genocide. Now, just getting a little bit off my book, is that there is the strong argument that, there just hasn't been the understanding of cognitive development, and that is important, and this is sort of a footnote that, a lot of these dictators are going to be that kind of person that would, take the money, and so it is a real tight issue that this corruption sort of is a fallout almost naturally of that kind of situation. That's sort of the global struggle, tensions that are actually, and can't easily be resolved in any sense. I don't believe that. It's a tough hurdle. And I do, unlike Ron Paul, I do think we have to play a role as sort of moral leaders in these other countries. I don't believe that we can just shut them off and just say totally isolationist. That is, I think we do have to play some sort of moral leadership role in some sense, because of our education, because of our prosperity and stuff. Yes. So Edward Griffin points out that many of these people are committed to over-regulated socialist regimes, end quote. An example of which is fleshed out in a frightening statement made by George Bernard Shaw, trumpeting a Fabian-style government. I quote, "Under socialism, you would not be allowed to be poor. You would be forcibly fed, clothed, lodged, taught, and employed whether you liked it or not. If you discovered that you had not the character and industry enough to be worth all the trouble, you might possibly be executed in a kindly manner. But whilst you were permitted to live, you would have to live well," end quote. So, it's nice that you'd be executed in a kindly manner. To simplify above, the method by which world socialism was to be established, and seemingly still is, I believe, is to use the World Bank as one mechanism to transfer money disguised as loans to the governments of the underdeveloped countries, enforced by EMFs, EHMs, economic hitman jackals, and other evolving mechanisms, to do so in such a way as to ensure the demise of free enterprise and the flourishing of an elitist type of socialism, quote. So, doing all this while leaving as small a trail as possible, a mere whisper of the fact that this is all being consciously designed. a whisper all too often drowned out by the loud and eye-catching distractions all around us. So back to the broader picture of self-created war. Of course, there have been cases of non-governmental created terrorist acts. That said, there have been many other terrorist activities that modern-day governing structures have played a big part in rolling out. One way to understand this better is to look to where governing officials tend to put their intellectual focus and effort. So, for example, John Negroponte, who was the director of intelligence, to be exact, he was in charge of counterterrorism during the Bush Jr. administration. Chomsky, so he actually was in charge of counterterrorism. But Chomsky points out, in the Reagan-Bush Sr. administration, he was ambassador to Honduras, and he was running the world's largest CIA station. Not because of the grand role of Honduras in world affairs, but because Honduras was the primary U.S. base for the international terrorist war, for which Washington was condemned. They were condemned by the International Court of Justice and UN's Security Council, absent the U.S. vote or veto. End quote. In other words, Negroponte, having been in the past condemned by the international community, or at least the organization of which he was a part, working during the Reagan-Bush Sr. administration, was a causal agent in the terrorist activity, and then becomes, in the Bush Jr. administration, the person in charge of counterterrorism. Problem. And then the conclusion that about the war situation. So, from the sinking of the Lusitania to the World Trade Centers to the Gulf of Tonkin, these are but a few cases where wars, if not self-created or false flag, were turned to be advantageous and become profitable for a wealthy few. This has been an often used strategy by many of the world's most powerful to further their desired agendas and centralize power. This stretches back. I've read some things about princes using this. Like, for example, there was one case where I think it was a nephew. A prince sent something saying to a friend or a nephew that, my peasants are getting uppity. We need to create another war. Send your people over. And so the Rothschild family shows signs of pulling off these sorts of dastardly tactics as far back historically as the Napoleonic Wars. These tactics have evolved, however, now including economic hitmen, jackals, and infrastructure like the World Bank. Without what appears to be a real moral conscience, these individuals have time and again strategically set conditions to arise that you may only have thought about in your darkest of nightmares. Melodramatic there. So this chapter paints a bit of a picture as to how and why wars might be waged for reasons known to the average population, although I think we're becoming a lot more aware of this. The creation of wars for more or less self-interested purposes appears to be historically not uncommon, and therefore it would be unadvisable to think that without some massive overhaul in how our governing systems function, these sorts of activities will simply continue and maybe even worsen. We are, I believe, morally called to act on this information in some way. But before we explore these possibilities in depth, in the third section of my book, which I deal with the attempted integration of sort of integral theory and this stuff, hold the question, why haven't you heard more about this in history classes or TV and such? One more battle cry made by Voltaire. It's dangerous to be right when the government's wrong. Here we have seen a case of governments doing wrongdoing. I'll leave it at that. Sorry. Hate it.